Okay, right. Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Edinburgh Entrepreneurs second summer panel event, proudly supported by Pivomo and Rate My Placement, who have helped to support this event today. I'm the host, Harrison Winaligo, and this panel will attempt to answer the question, what will business be like post-pandemic? In a time of great uncertainty, our panelists will discuss what the future holds for the business world. We will explore the concept of a new normal and evaluate how COVID-19 has shaped the next steps for business operations. I will start by introducing the panelists individually, allowing for some time for them to discuss their work and introduce the themes that they would like to explore. Then we'll move on to our 3/4 questions before opening it up to the YouTube live chat to allow for audience Q&A. Without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing our first panelist, Tim Connolly. Tim has spent almost his entire career as a business change consultant, initially with KPMG, but for the past 26 years in niche firms of which he was a founder and principal. His primary interest is in helping organizations build deep, permanent change readiness into their culture and ways of working. He recently launched Aptimus and will be updating us with what he's up to. And this is to properly equip companies for the world of continuous automation-driven change. Apologies. Right, so without further ado, Tim, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Harrison. Hi, everyone. It's slightly weird talking to lots of people and not being able to see you, but that's part of the new normal, I guess, that we're all getting used to. As Harrison says, my background is in business change, and it's been a big thing for me for probably 20 years that organizations of all size need to accept change as a reality, a day-to-day reality in the way that they operate. It's a business as usual competence, and it still doesn't manage that way in lots of organizations. Harris has asked that each of us just make a few points relevant to the question as we, by way of introduction. So let me throw out, I suppose, 4 things as some thoughts on the discussion, what will business be like post-pandemic. The first is that working practices and arrangements will be very different. Remote working has become widely accepted, and indeed it'll remain a necessity for some time in many cases. Even where it's not enforced, both companies and individuals are seeing the potential for more flexible working arrangements, and that'll play a big part in how organizations operate. It'll change how people connect with one another. It already is. It'll change how leaders connect, how leaders create a culture, the environment they want, and it'll affect how offices and workspaces are used. So I think that's one big thing. Second thing that I think maybe hasn't had so much attention so far is that the ecosystem that we operate in will have changed. For a lot of organizations, they'll find that competitors or suppliers or partners or customers may have gone bust, and that could disrupt their supply chain. It could mean they lose business. It could make operating more difficult, but it could also create new opportunities. And I think that's going to be a second big thing to deal with. The third one is that we're going to, the question is about what life's going to be like post-pandemic. And I'm trying to avoid using phrases like post-anything, post-pandemic, post-COVID, because we're going to be living with COVID for quite a long time. Even if the virus is absent from a particular location, even a particular country, we're one incoming plane passenger away from it returning. And many businesses surprised themselves a few months ago at how quickly they were able to respond to the burning need to fundamentally change how they operated in order to close offices and other workplaces. But they now know they could have to do that again overnight if there's an upturn in cases, resulting in local lockdown. So I think that's going to play on a lot of organizations' minds for the foreseeable future. But the fourth thing, and really the most fundamental, is that changes that were already on the way pre-COVID, we can certainly talk about pre-COVID, even if we can't talk about post, changes that were already on the way will be accelerated. And I touched on some of them. The relationship with the office, adoption of remote working, greater flexibility, it was already happening. It's being accelerated by what's going on at the moment. So is interest in genuine business-driven, business-wide automation. Lots of the organizations I've spoken to over the last few months found that when they looked at how their processes actually operated, which prior to the migration to remote working, which they had to do in order to be sure that they managed the migration effectively. Many of them found shortcomings and defects with really significant potential for improvement, and specifically for automation. And the other aspect on automation, and I think this is a delicate subject, but it can't be avoided. Human beings look like an increased risk in the age of a pandemic. It may sound harsh in the current environment, but some organizations will conclude that they will be better protected in future if they use machines more and humans less. So, that, by the way, that creates opportunity as well as threat, but I think that's a real consideration. So those would be my 4 things to put into the conversation: changing working practices, changing the ecosystem, constant readiness for the possibility of another lockdown, and the acceleration of those natural changes that were coming in the world of business already.
Perfect, Tim. Yes, thank you for putting it into 4 distinct points. I think you're definitely right about the precariousness of the situation, where we don't really know if there's going to be another outbreak or another virus. And I think going forward, that's definitely something we need to consider. So our second panelist, Teddy Lee. In 2014, Teddy founded Maki and Ramen, blending transferable aspects of Japanese culture and assimilating it into Western culture of Edinburgh. During the early days of the Maki and Ramen project, there was one shop and the supply chain was just local supermarkets. Maki and Ramen have now expanded to 5 stores in the centre of Edinburgh, 5 restaurants in the centre of Edinburgh, and have recently opened a new one in Glasgow. It's also a personal favourite of mine while studying, so it's great to have him here. Teddy, over to you.
Hi guys, thank you for having me. Okay, so the way that I see restaurant in my industry is it's gonna be really bad, to be honest. So we lost the festival, which is normally we do like double or triple than the sales on that period of time, and we probably going to lose the Christmas booking as well. We have this 2-meter distance, which is reducing half of the capacity, so from 80 to 40 to 30 to 10. That's all the negative things. The customer perspective will be slightly different as well. You will see a lot of cleaning, a lot of like antibacterial spraying around the touch point. I can see also in a good point of things, which is there will be new technology. I think most likely to be QR code menu or pre-order menu before you coming over. There will be less interaction between the customer and then the service. So all that, there will be lots of restaurants closing down. Those restaurants who announced will be closing down soon. Those are the ones who already know their numbers, which is they already know that's not going to work, and then they decide to close. Some of them don't even know the number, and this is when some of the business were going to hurt so much. But speaking about opportunities, today's the day 1. I just opened another ramen shop in Edinburgh, and that's I call it like a different name. But then hopefully that will be like giving me even more opportunity in the high street the restaurants. This is how I see that. Yes, that's pretty much what I think about the pandemic things. So this is all this kind of a negative things. The good things in there is there will be more shop the opening. I think the kind of like the AI shops will be more popular for the later on. In terms of like not many people touching food and then serving it. I also think that because it's very similar to the Asian one, the SARS in Hong Kong, after a few years, everything back to normal. So hopefully that will what happen. And I'm not too worried about there will be another pandemic coming over.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Teddy. I'm really excited about your new store. I didn't realize that you were opening one, so this is, super optimistic about that. Our third panelist, Zakia Mulai Gary. Zakia is founder and CEO of Invisible Cities, a global social enterprise that trains people who have been affected by homelessness before and trains them to become walking tour guides. She has previously been head of innovation, events and partnerships for Social Bite and has been a guest lecturer at TEDx and various universities. Hidden Cities operates in 5 cities, including Edinburgh. So yeah, Zakia.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on this panel. So I guess where we come from is 2 different places, because we are a tour operator, but we are also a social enterprise. And so in terms of tourism, you know, the whole sector is, I mean, like everybody else, has been hit really badly. And in our case, we've seen, you know, our income kind of get to 0 in about 1 week at some point, you know, which with everything getting cancelled and groups no longer come in, and there's a lot of uncertainty as to what tourism will look like, whether tourists will travel again, will they come to Scotland, will they fly? But there's also a lot of opportunity, I think, for a different focus, which would be more on domestic tourism, you know, people staying at home and rediscovering their cities. I find that in a city like Edinburgh, there's a lot of collaboration going, and that's a wonderful place to be and do business in, because I think there's a wish to kind of work all together and towards making, you know, a great product, a great experience. So in our case in particular, you know, we work closely with the EICC or with hotels in the city that really want to create the whole package for travelers who come to Edinburgh and experience what the whole of Edinburgh has to offer. So I think the pandemic gave us the time to think about what that package could look like and how we want tourism to be, how we want to welcome people, you know, and I think it's made a lot of people really creative in how we promote Scotland and how we promote Edinburgh. And prior to, I mean, to this happening, there were a lot of discussions around words which I don't really like, but like over tourism, and is tourism done right in Edinburgh, and should it change? Are there too many Airbnbs? You know, all of these conversations that I absolutely agree should happen, but you know, there were a lot of different voices out there, and at least putting the world to stop has made people reconsider how they travel, why they travel, and what they want to create as an impact. And that's where I think for us, we've been really enjoying and kind of really seeing the thrive and this want from people to support locally the causes or the businesses or the people that they know. So for a lot of people to say, well, I can't go, in our case, I can't go on the tour, but how can I support you? What gift voucher can I buy? You know, and I live in Leith in Edinburgh, and there's been a lot of that going on. How can I support the little business right next to me? You know, so for us, it's been an interesting one, because even though we are in different locations, we in different cities across the UK, each city has had this little local pocket of support and of people wanting to create that local impact. As a social enterprise, we work with vulnerable people and people who have complex issues, and the pandemic has only highlighted issues around housing, around mental health, around well-being. So it's been definitely a challenge, but I think it's also highlighted the importance of having organizations that move things around and, you know, will want to change the world for the better in terms of what the future holds. I think, and I hope that there will be a shift in people's perception on what impact do they want to have. And for me, and it's a thing I often speak about and I'm really passionate about, and how do you want to spend your money? Because in our day and age, you spending your money in a place that you have chosen can be an act of activism. It can have a voice, it can say something. So you know, having had the time to think about that has definitely, I have witnessed, made people think about those things, whether it's, you know, supporting locally and not going to big chains anymore, or how they can get involved. So I think I really don't know what the future of tourism is, whether it's in Scotland, England, or around the world. There's a lot of doom and gloom, and a lot of you know, I see really, really big corporations and big companies or tour operators kind of, you know, letting go of staff or closing their door, and there's a lot of conversations that happen around what the future holds. But at the same time, I'm really optimistic in that mentalities will change.
Definitely, definitely. I think it's really easy to become pessimistic, at least in Edinburgh, having the Fringe Festival being cancelled this year. In the short term, lots of people are very worried about tourism. So I think what you're saying about supporting the local community and shopping local and getting involved, like at least in the short term, they're really, really important. So yeah, great. And then finally, Simon Pullister-Jones is our fourth panelist. Simon is CEO and founder of Woken Up, the new global platform for social and environmental change. It's an application, it's very good, I recommend it. Prior to founding Woken Up, Simon had a 20-year career as a financial services lawyer, high-profile lobbyist, and a trade association CEO in the City of London. So Simon, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Harrison, for the introduction. Thanks for the kind words, and thanks for this opportunity. So I guess what COVID presents us with an opportunity to ask ourselves is, what is the world and society in which we want to live? And is the world and society in which we want to be living in 2030 the world that we have right now and the world that we had immediately pre-lockdown? It was interesting to see Sky News survey hundreds of people on that very question. Do you want to go back to how things were pre-lockdown? And 91% of people who responded said they don't want to go back to how it was. And that's not surprising, because actually times were changing in the run-up to the lockdown anyway. Last year felt a little bit like the 1960s. I'm too young to have lived through that time, but that sense of dissatisfaction with the status quo obviously saw Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion on the one hand. It saw protests in Hong Kong, and now we've seen the reaction to that. Protests like the Gilets jaunes in France. There was just a general dissatisfaction with the way the world is. And we saw the corporate world really waking up to this change in mood, so that last August, there were 181 leading CEOs of corporate America who signed a letter that said that we recognize now that people want something different, and we can't just act in the best interests of shareholders and shareholders alone anymore. We need to look at the interests of the wider stakeholder community. So times were changing. The last decade for me was all about one word, and that word was selfie. It was all about me, and the world was increasingly, thanks to automation and things like Uber and Deliveroo and everything else, was increasingly built around me. This decade was changing as we came into it. It was teeing itself up to be the decade that was all about the P word, purpose. So rather than about me, it was a decade all about everybody else and making a difference. And there's a risk that COVID disrupts the momentum that was building through Greta and Extinction Rebellion, through this sense of protest, through the corporate world, saying, actually, we want to be more sustainable. We want to do more to promote diversity and more equality. We want to be better. And so it's not an understatement to say that we're perhaps at the most pivotal moment in humanity's history right now. And we were probably there anyway, even without COVID. But what this last 3 or 4 months has given us the opportunity to do is to pause and reflect on, what do we want the world to look like? And we were heading towards this world of more sustainability, more equality. But the immediate reaction when the lockdown came was very economic. It was furloughing 1 in 5 workers in the UK. It was cancelling programs focused on diversity. It was cancelling programs focused on sustainability. It was very much focused on cash flow and on the bottom line and preserving the business economically. If there was a lot of focus on sustainability over the last 12 months in particular, now there's a huge focus on health and safety. Whether you be an employee or a customer, the focus is making sure that you're as safe as humanly possible. And as business, we've obviously seen an increase in remote working. I run a social network that's all about building a better tomorrow. And we look to do that by creating a critical mass of people and organizations who want to build back better. And the question is that still going to be a priority for people, or are we going to retreat back to focusing on ourselves? And so I think there's a huge opportunity, as the other speakers have been saying. I think what's really important is in the immediacy of dealing with today's problems, we don't lose sight of that question of what is the world in which you want to be living in 10 years' time? And it's critical that when we pivot our businesses and we navigate our way through, that we take the opportunity to better align our businesses with the promotion of the society, the environment, and the economy that we want to see when we're able to get back to normal again. And just finally, how far away might back to normal be? Well, it was interesting talking to Heathrow Airport last week, talking to their sustainability team, all of whom are currently furloughed. And they were having 250,000 customers a day coming through the airport in January. Now they believe it's going to take up to 4 years to get back to how things were in January. 4 years. And partly that's because of this new normal of the business environment, because as Tim was saying earlier, there's an increase in remote working. We don't need to travel around the world as much as I used to when I was the trade association CEO. We can just do it through Zoom and Whereby and other apps now. So there's a fundamental shift in behavior, but I think the critical thing is that we really continue to focus on the opportunities to build a more sustainable future, rather than this being, when we look back in 10 years' time, the biggest missed opportunity to create that more sustainable future.
Yes, 100%. And I just want to reiterate, 91% is a staggering figure. And if people really are wanting to avoid the previous status quo that much, it is very evident that there will need to be change in the future. So hopefully we can refresh and start to push towards a more positive, purposeful business environment in the future. Anyhow, let's kick off with the questions. My first question is regarding the new normal. So upon reflection of the 2008 global financial crisis, the phrase new normal, suggesting a fundamental shift in the business landscape, was commonly discussed. The coronavirus has reintroduced this idea, and therefore I would like to put it to the panel to discuss what this new normal will look like and how companies and startups will be forced to adopt and facilitate the shift in business practice. Just anyone can hop in.
Well, so I guess the last major crisis we dealt with pre-Brexit was the 2008 financial crisis. And I had privilege is probably entirely the wrong word, but I specialized in the financial products that caused the financial crisis in 2008. I was in the legal department of an investment bank in Canary Wharf at the time. And so I had a front row seat on the run up to the crisis. And as I was then running a trade association for the world's leading investment banks until January last year, what we saw was the response to the financial crisis was regulation. And that regulation was designed to make the financial services world a lot safer than it was before, and to provide a lot more of a buffer to protect against losses. And we may now see the sustainability and environmental version of that through COVID. What we're now seeing is regulation again being the response to crisis. In this case, I went to a National Trust property yesterday. I went to a wildlife park today. I'm on holiday this week. And what I really noticed was attempts through regulation, through law, to force social distancing. It's got all the challenges that Teddy mentioned for the hospitality sector about massively reducing the number of people you can have in a physical space. So it puts huge pressure on business models. So I think the short term and the medium term answer, probably, Harrison, is that we'll see a lot more regulation of our behavior, and that we will get used to this new normal of being slightly further apart, doing more video conferencing. In the short term, perhaps the medium term, there will be a relentless focus on cash flow and bottom line and survival. But over time, we will see people seizing the opportunity. The short-term opportunities have very much been in the health and safety sector. Those businesses that are selling face shields instead of what they were doing before, which is building plastic toys. They've repurposed their factories to seize this opportunity. So I think we'll see regulation drive a lot of change. And the question is, there's probably a short to medium term new normal, which is the immediate response to the crisis. And then there's the longer term new normal, which is where do we go from here, and building towards that more sustainable, more equitable future that many people, in particular the under 25s, Generation Z, are so keen for. But perhaps the most singular important impact on the new normal in the next 6 months is the US presidential election. I just heard today Bolsonaro, the Brazilian leader, has got COVID. We know where Donald Trump is on that. If Donald Trump gets re-elected in November, history goes one way. If he doesn't, history goes another way. It's one of the most pivotal elections I can think of, certainly in my lifetime as someone who's 44.
Perfect. And Zakir, I saw you nodding your head there. Oh, Tim's turned off his mic.
So go on, Zakir, go first. Go first. I'm just lining up.
Just a couple of things that was said around your business model and adapting to what the new reality is, and I think, and I recognized, or I agreed with a lot of things, because I think in the first instance you had a lot of businesses, organizations that wanted to change what they were doing. So you can see that happen with the toy making into plastic, protective equipment making. That's an easy transition. But for us, for instance, we really wondered, should we do, virtual experiences and focus a lot more of what we do online, when actually at the core of who we are is this face-to-face experience and you experiencing a city. So I think the new world will be about adaptability and being able to pivot quickly, and there's a lot of big companies that have, and that I admire for, and I admire them for that. But also I think then in the future it will be about staying true to who you are. If my business model is based upon that, and I guess this is even more relevant to maybe organizations like mine in social enterprises, to staying true to the values and not changing everything for the sake of your cash flow or your income. And I know it sounds easier said than done, but it's definitely a thing that we've thought a lot about and we've worked on a lot during this time of being locked down with my team. Is what is true to our core, and what are we willing to change and adapt on, because it's the world where we have to do that, but what are we not willing to change and adapt on. And I really believe that with customers that we have and the customers that we will keep on having, or the emergence of people who want to see maybe more value in what they buy or where they go, that will be important. So I think it's definitely to be put out there is, yes, there is an immediate cash flow. I need money in because everything has been cancelled and all of that. But ultimately, should I just maybe fold this business and create another one if me adapting means it's way too far away from my original mission-driven business? That's what it popped into my head when you were speaking there, and that's why I was nodding as well.
Shall I go next?
Sure.
I think, gosh, so many things to say. This whole point about purpose that both Simon and Zakir have talked about. I fundamentally believe that companies that have a strong sense of purpose end up being more successful. And I think the word I keep coming back to when I think about the new normal, which a bit like post-COVID is a phrase I'm not wild about, but the future is that I keep coming back to acceleration. I think completely agree with what Zakia in particular has said, that there are things that many organisations, probably some, well, clearly including some of those represented on this panel, have just got to do to just stay alive. But I think there does seem to be a lot of thinking and talking about purpose in over the last few months, and the organisations, whatever sort of entity they are, that hold their nerve and remember why they exist, I think will be the ones that succeed. And the reason I mention acceleration is that there was definitely a shift towards sustainability. As Simon mentioned earlier, the interest of the wider stakeholder groups, not just of shareholders. That's one of the many developments that was well in train anyway. And given that I think that the biggest overall impact of the pandemic is going to be to speed us up along the journey we were already on, I think it's inevitable that we will end up talking more about purpose in the coming months and years.
Okay, perfect. And Teddy, did you want to add anything there?
So I try to figure out where's the mold is. Yes, so for me, I think that the company need to have this growth mindset, like changing from what we're doing right now to what we wanted to do in the future. Because now if there is less people coming out and there's social distancing, how do we going to sustain our restaurant business? So we were thinking of such as things like opening like a delivery stuff, because then we can, we know that there will be more people sitting at home now. So we have to like open the delivery platform for us. So we never done any delivery service before. And this is what we're going to do in the future. So this is something that, in a growth mindset, people need to change and do something different rather than just sit there and do the same things after the pandemic.
Definitely. It's all about how you adapt to these situations and what you can do to make an impact going forward. Perfect. So I think we'll leave that question there. The second question. So this outbreak has come at a time when globalization was already under serious threat from the trade war between the US and China, and growing uncertainty over the future of free trade as a whole, from the EU relationships with the UK and various other situations. Shocks to global supply chains, such as the 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami, were seen as one-off events. This sentiment is now changed, with coronavirus amplifying ideas of a transition towards domestic protectionism and localized supply chains. Is this a temporary ideological shift, or is it the beginning of the end for globalization and long-distance supply chains? Tim, yeah.
Okay, I think we have to distinguish between domestic protectionism and localized supply chains. Clearly, there's some overlap, but I do think they're different things. This is probably me being an optimist, but I'm also a historian, and domestic protectionism will pass. It can take a long time. It raises its head from time to time. It will pass. The long term, the world will only survive through minimizing barriers to trade. And that's what I'm going to say about that. Happy to come back to it. But localized supply chains, again, yes, I think COVID-19 will be instrumental in a major rethink of long-distance supply chains, because, again, I think it's an acceleration. Environmental concerns in particular have been coming increasingly into play. But as far as the direct COVID impact is concerned, I think it comes down to the fundamental principle of balancing costs and risk. In extreme circumstances like a pandemic, supply chains are disrupted in general, but when you've got industries that have become over-reliant on a small number of sources of supply, and that's risky anyway, and when those sources of supply are disrupted or at risk of being disrupted, that forces the mind. And when it's a thought process that was going on anyway, which I think it was in many parts of business, then I think it's bound to accelerate it. But I think it's also important to stress that the extent and pace of that change, you need to keep it into context, because in some areas, localization will be impossible in the short term and maybe even in the long. I mean, to give an example, I was at one of many virtual events over the last few months. I was on one a couple of months ago, and one of the speakers was the CEO of a UK-based high-tech company. And he said there are only 3 companies in the world who can supply us with the semiconductors that we use. One of them is Intel in the US, but he said they're falling behind in their ability not just to provide volume, but to actually provide the products we need. Both of the other suppliers are in China, and new suppliers are not going to pop up in that market overnight. China's also way ahead in the supply of printed circuit boards, and we've got all the issues about the relationship with China, which go way beyond the coronavirus. But we are not going to be able to, simply untangle ourselves from some of those supply chains. So there will be limitations to how far it can go.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tim. I think certainly it's far too early to call the end of globalization or peak globalization. The reality is the business world is global. What we're seeing, as Tim said, is an acceleration in the focus on that supply chain, and an increasing amount of regulation now requiring certainly the world's largest companies to look at the sustainability of their supply chain. So it may be more this pressure on sustainability and supply chain management being the thing that shortens the supply chain. But I don't see a return to localism and only being able to get raspberries from Kent, but not raspberries from the other side of the channel in my local supermarket, for example. The NHS, when they were getting face masks initially to deal with COVID, were getting them from China. In fact, in some cases, we're getting them from Wuhan. Strange that seems. We're obviously going into the end game of Brexit. My day job, whilst I was a lobbyist for investment banks, was to spend a lot of time speaking to the European Commission and to the UK's Treasury about their policy on cross-border financial services. And it seems unlikely to me that a true no-deal scenario where trade just absolutely stops on a cross-border basis I don't see that as a realistic outcome. So we will find a way, even if we get to a no-deal outcome, of nonetheless still continuing a flow of goods and services across the channel. I do agree that the US is retreating from the world stage somewhat at the moment. It's stepping back from the role as the world's policeman and the world's moral leader, and America first is increasingly introspective as a model, and how long that continues will be driven again by the outcome of the elections in November. We don't imagine that Joe Biden, if elected president, will continue that isolationist approach, quite the opposite. And we're seeing an increasingly assertive European Union now, as they see the US pulling back. France and Germany in particular are asking themselves the question, well, what's the role of the EU as being the third pole in the global politics between US and China? So we're seeing Europe wanting to reassert itself and have a more singular role on the world stage that is less reliant on the countries outside of the European Union. That being said, we'll have to see how the future of the European project goes, with reportedly Denmark, Italy, and Greece all evaluating whether they want continued membership of the European Union. So a very uncertain time, but specifically on globalization, far too early to call it peak globalization.
Yes, brilliant. So, I mean, when I was 16, after school, I used to work in a pub, and just a bit of context, I used to understand how how important it is to make sure you get the food at the right time, before service starts and things like this. So I think this question is more for Teddy, but how do you think like the supply chain disruption, even if it's not a global supply chain, like a localized supply chain disruption, is affecting you?
So for me, I can see also, well, already suppliers coming, because I normally order things from Japan. They send it to London and they send it to me. So now the supply is also already very low. Plus, it's also it's getting more expensive as well. I think it's just because the labor cost, the minimum wage, plus the Brexit, plus the COVID-19 and stuff. So yes, it is quite bad for me for that side. But then now what I'm trying to do is just buying more locally, such as fish and stuff like that. So yes, so this is my solution for that. I just want to rephrase the questions. I mean, the way that that people think that the COVID-19 or the pandemic, there will never be a right time for having a pandemic. So if because now normally you say like the pandemic is coming, the trade war is coming, and everything bad thing is coming. But when people receiving something that is bad to him, and he starts to think about other bad things connected to that. So I just want to change this mindset, and then changing that's separate, that's not even related to that. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And then Zakia, do you have any thoughts on this?
Right. So for us, it's a bit different, but I think I worked in collaboration before with some companies and organizations in the fashion industry, for instance, where obviously the supply chain is something that was questioned quite a lot. And the shift of wanting to at least trace or have sustainability or have, fair rights every step of the way is not something that is new. I think there's been, over the last few years, a kind of realization that, again, going back to what I was saying, you can make a difference by looking at, even if it's one step within that chain. So whether or not this will bring more consciousness to it, I hope so. But it's, I'm not sure, I think it does create, it makes you realize that what it made me realize, the pandemic, is that we are a lot closer, than what we think from one another. And if you think about those chains, like what Teddy was saying about, his supplies and things like that, is one big world, and from one side of the world to the other, but actually something like that happens and everything stops. But I think the shift for wanting things more local and for wanting things more traceable and fairer and more impactful was something that I think a lot of people had already started thinking about, and either it accelerated, I totally agree with that, it's made that process accelerated definitely during the pandemic.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, fantastic answers. I'm very conscious of time. We're actually only supposed to have 15 minutes left, and we've collected a lot of questions on YouTube. So I'm going to start running through them. So our first question, what steps do you think should be taken to save jobs amidst pandemic and fear of Brexit by businesses?
I'm glad I'm not the Chancellor. I've become a Keynesian over the last 3 months. I think I'm not a fan of Boris Johnson at all. I think that the financial and economic stimulus that Rishi Sunak has put into place so far, it's far from perfect, but I think it's if I say well-intentioned, I don't mean that in a patronizing way. I think it is going to be essential for government to take the risk that investment in major projects, infrastructure, generating demand will help to kickstart the economy and create jobs. It probably goes against the instinct of every member of Johnson's cabinet, but they've got to where they are now, and I think it's essential.
Yeah. Could I ask you to repeat the question, Harrison, just so I make sure I reply to it?
Yes, of course. What steps do you think should be taken to save jobs amidst pandemic and fear of Brexit by businesses?
Thank you. So it's been interesting to see cities like Amsterdam adapt new economic models. In their case, a model called donut economics, which looks very much not just at pure economic interests, but social and environmental interests as well. And to see countries like New Zealand perform staggeringly well under Jacinda Ardern, who created what she called the well-being budget. So I think there's a lot of focus on just our fundamental physical and mental health, just our general well-being. And we're seeing an increasing number of governments really focus on that. Some were doing so pre-COVID, some have accelerated doing that post-COVID. And as you say, Tim, now is not the time for Trumpian economics of looking after the very, very wealthy and to hell with everyone else. It's very much a time for government support, for us to encourage our governments to support the nation and to support the international family as best they can, so that we've got policies that are better aligned to the future that we want when we come out the other side of COVID. And in the meantime, that really does mean looking after the most vulnerable right now in our society, because if we don't, then we're going to have way more inequality than we had when we went into COVID, which was already at pretty horrific levels. So now is the time for governments to support, and also it's the time for businesses, large and small, to support their local communities and community as a whole. And to Tim's point, people want to buy from, work for, and invest in companies with purpose. And so if you're a company using your time, your money, your expertise, not only to sell us stuff, but to improve societal outcomes, to help your local community, your economic reward will come through that with the improved brand value that you'll generate by being a solid corporate citizen, a very purpose-driven business.
Sorry, Harrison, I froze for a moment. Then I think I missed some part of what Simon said. But I completely agree with everything you just said.
Okay, fantastic. And Teddy and Zakia, is there anything you'd like to add before I move on?
No, I also agree with the well-being of, as a company, what can I do to keep jobs? Or I think one of the first things that I ever was told when I started a business was by one of my mentors, who said, always remember that people do business with other people and people work with other people. So I think at the core of everything is to treat people for everything that they are. And as an employer, when stuff started happening and you're starting to have to think of making decisions, of whether it's furloughing in this country or, making redundancies or whatever, I think treating people with respect and as other human beings is sometimes underrated. And I think it's, there's nothing better for a team and for a person to thrive than to know that they are being considered and that they are being respected. And so a lot of sometimes what I say is that our ethos is all around honesty and honest conversations. And sometimes those conversations can be hard, as an employer towards someone else, that you have to reduce hours or that you have to make redundant, but they are necessary. And so I think it goes back around this having values at the core of what you do and putting the person at the center and trying to respect them. And I think in return, what maybe your staff does is that they also understand that at the end of the day, if you don't have the money, you're not generating the income, then you can't sustain their roles. So they're more likely to work with you towards, finding other solutions. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of when I got told that, I was quite surprised. I was like, oh yeah, this is pretty obvious. But actually, now it's a phrase that I always keep thinking about, is that people, want to be treated as people and for everything that they are, if that makes sense. So that goes back a lot to what was said just, earlier.
Okay. Is that
Yes.
it? Yeah, sure.
So can I just add something small? So well, for us, it's very, very simple. There's just open back all the restaurants and coffee shop and all these cinemas and everything. That's all for me done. But then also reduce the 2 meter distance. But then I think there's one very, very important thing, which is face mask. I think that there's a big difference between the Asian, when the Chinese, for example, they like, you must wearing face mask, and over here it's like you can, but you don't have to. And I think that's the difference between stopping the COVID, because in a lot of places in Asia, they just operate it very normally, but everyone wearing the face mask, and that's all it's about. So it's not about a 2 meter distance, because if I touch something, you touch it. That's what I'm thinking. So, okay, thank you.
Sure. Yes, that's great. Okay, so I think we're going to try and squeeze in 3 more questions. So try and keep it nice and brief.
Keep it brief.
Next question is, what do you feel the consequences of the what do you feel the consequences of a second lockdown should be?
So since you're talking to universities, we're really trying to position Woken Up at the intersection of global brands and youth. So we're talking to a lot of universities, and a lot of them are thinking about September, October time and what it means for those universities. The short answer is potentially not opening up again at the beginning of term, or starting to have you back at the beginning of term only to shut down again. What we're seeing now, whether it be Leicester or Eastern Spain, is local lockdowns. So perhaps the way that we do lockdowns in the second wave will be different. We're much more localized to where the R numbers are a problem. I last weekend booked a week's holiday in France at the end of this month, in the expectation that France would be on the list of places that I can go to. But whether I'll be able to go, I don't know, because there could be a lockdown in another 3 weeks. So I think we're going to be living in a long period of uncertainty as to whether there will be second, third, fourth lockdowns, whether there will be a second or third wave. And if so, how much notice are we going to be given of a lockdown, and how long do we have as business owners to respond to second, third, fourth lockdowns? So a lot of it, frankly, is just about communication with local and national government to make sure that they keep the communication channels open so that we can adapt our businesses promptly, keep our customers safe, keep our employees safe, and do all we can to preserve and grow the economy in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I go back to something I said at the beginning. We have to be constantly ready for another lockdown, and I don't just mean emotionally ready. I mean companies, I mean government at both a national and a local level have to have plans in place, and we have to know what they are, because I think, honestly, Simon, the answer, if there's a lockdown, will be it'll happen immediately. It sort of has to. And so we have to be ready, and it's another acceleration. I mean, my company Aptimus is based on the Latin word aptum, which means adaptable. I chose that name because I believe everybody has to be more adaptable than ever before, no matter what walk of life they're in. And this is true with on a huge scale now. We're going to have to be able to respond very, very quickly.
Okay, right. As nobody's speaking up, we'll move on to the next question. Okay, this one's slightly more personal, and Simon, it touches on the idea of keeping employees safe. As a business, have you had to dismiss any workers due to COVID-19, and how did you feel about that? It doesn't specify whether it's furlough or actually just unfortunately have to make them redundant, but perhaps you can explore both.
Thank you. So we haven't dismissed anyone, we haven't furloughed anyone. I have a team of 5, and actually, if anything, our team has grown because we've had ever more people volunteering to help our business. The biggest impact that COVID's had on us is frankly around fundraising. We raised nearly £250,000 in the last 12 months, and we're currently looking to raise £500,000 so that we can build a online marketplace, if you like, an ethical Amazon. And it's very, very hard in the current climate raising capital from angel investors and VCs. VCs in particular completely shut up shop for the first couple of months after the lockdown, when the FTSE was diving and the economic situation was very unclear. So we haven't let anyone go, we haven't furloughed anyone, but one of our co-founders, we've got 3 co-founders, agreed to step away from the business until we successfully raise further equity, so that it gave us a longer runway. So we've definitely had to make changes to our business. And the second co-founder was a consultant being paid a market rate pre-lockdown. She then came into the business as a full-time employee, being paid half of what she was being paid before. So we are seeing, we have had to make adjustments on the personnel side of things. And if we don't get a tax rebate in the next week or so, we're going to have to look at further changes. So we're constantly evaluating the business's viability and changes we need. We're doing all we humanly can to avoid impacting people and focusing on everything else first. But there comes a point where you don't have a choice.
Brilliant. And see here, Teddy, I think this question is especially relevant for you, because my understanding is tourism and hospitality, as we know it, has sort of come to a standstill. So I think most of the workers working in your industries would be the ones directly affected by this. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, and for us, I think the added thing is that the people so we train people who have experienced homelessness to become tour guides. And unfortunately, that means that some of them, so in our team, for instance, we had a lot of people over the age of 60, or quite a few, and people with prior health issues, so who would fall more at risk of, being unwell. So we had to enforce for their own well-being, things like the lockdown and respecting government guidelines. And it was especially hard for those who maybe stayed in temporary accommodation or were put in hotels by the government. That wasn't always a really nice place to be, but I think that came with reinforcing and again looking after the well-being of people and that constant contact with them to ensure that they were mentally well and that they were aware of all the rules and nearly like training for them to be able to to respect and to be safe for themselves. And of course for others, and in terms of the team, so we have furloughed one person, and again I think I really liked that phrase, it's looking after people first, and then so everything else that we could do within the business before affecting roles and jobs. And our guides rely on like everybody else, but the income that they generate is vital to them. So we tried, there was nothing like that. So again, bear in mind we are special because we do work with a group of people that we support in loads of different ways. So when we stopped working, and obviously none of the tours happened, we committed to, instead of paying them a wage, paying them for the tours they would do, which we would normally do because there was no tour happening, we would deliver groceries to them. And that was our commitment and our promise, because we thought, if at least you're not working, then you're not in food poverty, you're eating, you're inside, after making sure that people could be safe physically. We also made sure that they could fuel properly. And so we've done that until this week. So every week, you know, a food delivery to them, and it's been a lifeline for them. And to us, it was a no-brainer because, you know, in any of our city, they are the best thing that our best asset, our best everything, and we wouldn't be able to have a company without the people within it. So it was a no-brainer, but it was again another way to look after them. So and for that, like going back to the fundraising, we have done a bit of fundraising for this to be able to fund, you know, grocery shopping and delivery to them. And the response of the public has been really good, but the response of maybe sponsors or maybe bigger donors that we would have gone to before the pandemic was, you know, a lot more difficult and non-existent, and that's because they had worries in other parts of, you know, they were not able to commit when in the past they would have. So I totally agree with that, but the response of the general public has been really, really good, with people wanting to support that, even if it was with just, you know, a very small donation. So really super thankful to that, and the guides and trainees are definitely as well.
So in my site for the restaurant industry, mid-March I had 85 employees, and then I got come down to 0. I follow them all, whoever I can, and then after that, I think about 2 months later, we started to open for takeaway only, and then so I can kind of like manage to hire like another 10 employee, and then I go open another one. So we are now in about 20 employees working, and the rest of it on furlough. I found that there is another problem here, which is the employee don't want to come back to work because they get this 80% and they're happy with not working and get. So what I did is like I text, because we have like a WhatsApp group, I text them saying like, okay, we're going to open that location. Who want to work? And like literally no one replying for that. And this what happened. But later on, the furlough will be reduced, and also there will be no furlough later. So I will see more people will coming up back again. So yeah, this is my perspective there. Thank you.
Okay, sure. We've just passed 6 o'clock, and I'm terribly sorry, but I really want to ask this one final question because it's quite a long one. It's on YouTube. It's been split in 2 different messages, so I think there was a character limit, but this will be the final question. How do you think environmental change will come about in the post-COVID world? As you said, there is 91% of people wanting change, but the difficulty is the how in relation to priorities. Could it also push that back due to the economic problems? So I think it's sort of trying to discuss, we are starting to prioritize the environment, and we want to incorporate sustainability in the way businesses operate, but what will be the economic implications of this, and how will you find a balance?
So I think as briefly as I can, why haven't we got that change already? Answer: lack of critical mass. The people and businesses who are taking action on promoting a more sustainable future are fragmented across thousands of online and real world communities. So that fragmentation means you don't have it all together in one place. My business, Woken Up, has been created to solve that specific problem. So what we're looking to do at wokenup.com is to bring together a critical mass of people, companies, and nonprofits who want a more sustainable future, who want Black lives to truly matter, who care about the causes that you care about, because the only way we're going to get the sort of change that you all want is if we can get a critical mass of people taking action to come together in a single place. And Woken Up as the global social network for social and environmental change. If you like Instagram for good or LinkedIn for ESG, Woken Up is designed to create that critical mass. So I think we can talk about behavior change. We can talk about each individual behavior change making a difference, which it does, but it's got to scale up to a tipping point. Tim's been talking about acceleration. Woken Up exists to accelerate the arrival of that tipping point to drive lasting, beneficial social and environmental change.
I hardly dare add to that. I think that's an absolutely brilliant way to finish this discussion, to be honest. I'll just reiterate, without something like what Simon has described, my fear, I'm going to be a bit negative, and I don't normally do negative, is that 91% would soon dissipate when people realize how very difficult it is. I think there's been, I've been party to and witnessed so many discussions over the last few months where people have talked in a slightly idealistic way about, just a glimpse of a future that they can see that will, by the time you come back to reality, it'll all dissipate. So and it ain't going to come from government. It's essential that organisations such as Simon's get that traction. I think that's brilliant.
Okay, any comments, Zakia or Teddy? As I said, this will be the final question, so the final opportunity to answer.
No, I agree. I think it's a brilliant way to end as well, and definitely something that is needed even from our perspective as a social enterprise or a company trying to do good within tourism, and traction and acceleration is. I totally agree with that. I think it's great to have the intention, but it is bloody hard to do, to try and have this impact or to change your behavior, and when things do open sometimes, I think and I hope that it will happen, but without that big traction, and it will be just difficult. So I think it was it sounds brilliant, and it's definitely needed as well from where I'm sitting. So yeah.
Okay, I think that may be it. Right, so thank you very much. It was wonderful to have all four panelists on. I've definitely learned a lot, and I think I've, gained a lot, at least going forward. It's fantastic to have, industry people giving me a student perspective on what things are going to be like going forward, especially post-graduation. To the audience, if you enjoyed this talk, please give us a like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We will be releasing various amounts of content throughout the rest of the summer and going into semester 1 next year. And also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We're posting regularly, so it'd be fantastic to keep up to date there. But until next time, thank you very much and take care. Right, okay.